Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for webinar 4, Planning, Consultation, and Best Practices for Developing Floodplain Mapping in Indigenous Communities. My name is Emily Amon, and I'm the Water Programs Lead for Green Communities Canada, joining you today from the traditional territories of the Hokuminam and Senkotan speaking peoples. The webinar is the fourth in a series of 5 weekly webinars that we are producing to share information about the Floodplain Mapping project that took place with the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation along Deshkan Zibi, also known as the Thames or Antler River. The next and final webinar will take place next week on Wednesday, March 23rd at this time, using the same Zoom link you used to join today. Please note, we will be keeping everyone's mic muted during the presentation, so we can cut out any background noise that it might make it hard for us to hear the speaker. We are also recording the webinar today so that it can be shared and viewed by those who couldn't attend in person. All past webinars, as well as the links to the slides, are available on the Green Communities Canada YouTube page. Today's session will focus on the development of floodplain mapping using the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation project as an example. Protocols and the importance of understanding and following them will be touched on. It will include an overview of some policies and legislation that can be harnessed to assist in upholding rights and responsibilities to Mother Earth, along with some examples of such. The purpose of this webinar is to share this information with you, but also to gather feedback from you on the content and delivery of the webinars and how you'd like to see future information shared. Please feel welcome to share any feedback you have with us in the chat box or in the survey link that we will share with you after the presentation. We have a pretty full agenda this afternoon and may not have time at the end of each presentation for a full Q&A. So please take note of the contact information of presenters, which has been included on the final slide for each presentation for follow-up. We have extended our meeting by about 15 minutes this afternoon for anyone who would like to stay on to ask a few questions after the presentations are through. You may also type questions into the chat box, which will be monitored by Brennan. If we are unable to answer a question today, we will do our best to follow up at next week's session, as we have done in other points during this webinar series. Please take a moment now to type in the chat box your name and what community or organization you are from. This will help us to keep track of who has attended. Thanks, everyone. That's all from me. I will now turn it over to Courtney Riley for our traditional opening.
Obojo, Chikip Indishnikas, Nimkibinasi Rodem, Deshkan Zibing Don Jaba, Ojibwe Nishna Bakeway Dao, Courtney Riley Chagnashi knows when. So for those of you who don't know me, my spirit name is Springwater Woman. I belong to the Thunderbird clan and I am from Chippewa Thames First Nation. And my English name is Courtney Riley. So I'm going to start out with an opening prayer and then offer up a song. And again, I'm here today at the Fork of the Thames. As you can see, it's a nice, beautiful, sunshiny day. So I'll start with an opening. Miigwech kajam do kimizyang mino gijigad nangom. Miigwech kajam do mino bamadzawin. Miigwech kajam do kinigego gajitoyan. Miigwech mishomaskizis so gibi wasa truang nangom. Miigwech nokmaskizis so gibi wasa truang debitkad. Miigwech Shkakamikwe, Gimizyang Nasewin, Gimizyang Nipe, Gimizyang Matagog, Gimizyang Lesiak, Gimizyang Nangog, Asema Begidnang, Wabanang, Jawanang, Epigishma, Queenwa, Givednang, Nadamushanang, Wijawishnang, Kinagego, Ashtigayang, Nigan, Nikea, Pane, Wemene, Ahomigwech. And just to translate that in English, I just said, thank you, Creator, for another beautiful day. Thank you, Creator, for this beautiful life. Thank you, Creator, for everything that you give to us. Thank you, Grandfather Sun, for shining on us today. Thank you, Grandmother Moon, for shining on us tonight. Thank you, Mother Earth, for the air, for the water, for the trees, and for the animals, and for the stars. And I offer my tobacco to the 4 directions, the east, the south, the west, and the north. And I ask that you help us and be with us in everything that we do, and humbly and most respectfully, thank you. So the song that's coming forward today is an honor song. And so honor songs are typically sung if you want to honor somebody for something that they've done. Today I just wanted to honor, like, it's such a beautiful sunshiny day. I do want to honor the sun for shining. It's so warm. It's 14 degrees here, and I think this has been the warmest it's been since last fall. So I'm gonna sing the Mi'kmaq honor song. I'm not fluent in Mi'kmaq, so I couldn't find my words for the translation, but I just remember that it just talks about respecting our nativeness and just talking about that. And so I'm gonna share that song. Give me take them on there. Big macho, how we done it. Let me take them on it. Gone when I think so. Big macho, Baba Huna Mato did it. Baba Huna Mato did it. Gone big so delicado. Se colas get out. Way hey, oh hey ha ya, way 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 oh hey ha ya, hey oh. Miigwech.
Get Jimmy Gwatch, Courtney, once again for that amazing opening to start us off in that good way. So, Anin Bojo, Minogijikad, Carrie Ann Charles Dishnakaz, Maingan Dunjaba, or sorry, Carrie Ann Charles Dishnakaz, Maingan Dodam, Anishinabekwa and Dow. Hello, my name is Carrie Ann. I'm from Georgina Island First Nation, also known as Shining Waters or Lake Simcoe. I'm of the Wolf Clan and I am a Anishinaabe woman. I am the Environment Partnership Coordinator for Cambium Indigenous Professional Services, and I will be your moderator for this series. Bean again. Welcome once again. As mentioned by Emily, we have another full agenda today, and this is our fourth of our 5 webinar series developed through the project known as the Floodplain Mapping and Integrated Watershed Management with the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, a shared watershed with a shared responsibility and an educational journey. This project has been funded by Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada through their ADAPT program. Hopefully you've been joining us over the past few weeks, but if you have not, and this is your first time, we have had the privilege of working with all 4 communities that are situated within the Lower Thames watershed along the Thames River, or as it is known to the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, who is the lead community for this project, Deshkan-Zibi or Antler River. The other communities include Oneida of the Thames First Nation, Munsee Delaware Nation, and Delaware Nation of Moravian Town. There have also been many other awesome project partners as represented on the top of the slide deck, in which you can learn more about on the registration page, as well as other participants such as the City of London and the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, who have shared knowledge as well as committed to continuing to work together to protect and preserve that in which sustains us all. As mentioned in the previous webinars, this is a phased project, and phase 2 is the project that we are here to share with you throughout this series. We believe that this project is a great example of Albert Marshall's two-eyed seeing and Willie Ermine's ethical space concept being actioned. With that, I would like to take a moment to apologize as I have incorrectly credited Reg Crowshoe for the ethical space concept, in which he was not the one that termed it, but actually further developed it. I have also been saying Reg's last name incorrectly, so I want to ensure that I took some time here to demonstrate the 7 grandfathers principle of humility. On that note, the intention of this project has been to assist the 4 communities in understanding not only the importance of undertaking floodplain mapping work, but also understand the methodology and process from the Western perspectives, including the effects of climate change. It has also been designed to create opportunities and encourage the community members to share their perspectives and knowledge so that it can be ingrained into the work being carried out, as well as bring valuable insight and a holistic view to the perspectives of the non-Indigenous project partners. These webinars have been developed with these same intentions and are geared at Indigenous communities, as well as those non-Indigenous folks that are undertaking these types of work, but also any environmental initiative. As noted, these sessions have all a pretty full agenda, and there may not be a lot of time for questions. So we ask that you please type your questions in the chat box, and if you do not get to them today, we will have answers for you in next week's seminar or webinar. The team was able to answer all of the questions throughout the session last week, so there are none to post in this for this afternoon. We will continue to do so for the next week's session, which will be our last session in this series. Next slide. So with that, I would like to invite Mark Peacock to start off with our first presentation of this session. So please take it away, Mark.
Can everybody hear me now? Hello?
Yep,
Yes.
we can hear you,
Okay,
Mark.
good. So my presentation is on developing floodplain mapping for the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. And I want to center it around what types of things other First Nations can take away from this, the types of learnings that we can get from the people of the First Nation that can help us in our job of developing the science behind this. And what we're doing is providing support to the First Nation as they develop products that are useful for them. Next slide, please. So one of the first things we can do is talk to the First Nation about what area of concern that we've got. And this may change as we get information from people from traditional knowledge. We know that we're talking about an area of low-lying ground adjacent to a river where there is flooding, but what that means to the nation and how that should be interpreted for their purposes is something that we can learn from them. We need to figure out the extents of the floodplain, where it's going to be a concern. We can use people's knowledge and particularly the traditional ecological knowledge to get an understanding of what is reasonable in this endeavor. And we need one of the things that is something that we need is to be specific and record this information so that our engineering studies can answer and talk to the knowledge that is in the community. Next slide. So one of the big questions is, what is the floodplain about? How does it flow? And this is something that is really important in making decisions as we create models of the floodplain. So if we can get the community to tell us about, does the water flow directly and straight lines without obstructions through the floodplain? Are there areas water flows around things? Is the water in the floodplain defined by areas that are moving? And if there are areas that are not, where are those areas? Tell us about how the water flows. How these questions are answered really helps the technical people get the right types of models and ensure that the model is defining the floodplain as it is truly flowing through that area. Next slide. So one of the things about the project is we want to maintain standards. We want these maps to be accurate to the point that they provide a standard of care to the people of the community. These maps affect people's lives and livelihoods, and it is really important that we keep that as an understanding of responsibility to the people that we're providing this information to. That's really important, that understanding of responsibility as we start. And it's very much along the lines of the responsibility to the river that we are told so often by the community that is part of the culture of this community. Thank you. Next slide, please. What types of documents do we use to make sure that we are providing the best information? Well, there are federal documents. So there's a bunch of documents here. These are the types of things we use to make sure that the science we're doing follows a standard that is acceptable for everyone in Canada. Next slide. There are provincial documents as well, and it depends on what province you're in. There could be other documents in other provinces. These are ones that we use in Ontario, but look for those documents. If you're looking as a First Nation to do this type of work, there are standards out there for the science. Make sure you get the best that you can have in doing that. Next slide. Some of those documents also rest outside of the country. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States, the American Society for Remote Sensing and Photogrammetry, ASPERS, those are the groups that help make sure that whatever work we do, we meet the standard that you would expect given the responsibility we're taking for that work. Next slide. So we need to choose a flood of concern for the community. And part of this has to do with what are the concerns, what are the risks the community see within the floodplain area. We provide a lot of stuff from our experience working as conservation authorities, and we use provincial guidance. It's very specific. It also is the guidance used by the communities around these First Nations. And therefore, it may be the types of things that the First Nations want to come in line with because the settler community around them are protected to those standards. So that's something we bring forward. There are a number of storms and a number of flood events the First Nation will want to look at. One that's often used is the 1% probability or the 1 in 100 storm. That's a storm that's often talked about. A peak flow of the largest event in your watershed. So in the Thames River, there was a massive flow in 1937, and therefore that was one of the flows that we talked to the nation about considering when they wanted to see what types of impacts and risks that would be on the community. We also brought forward the Hurricane Hazel, because that was, although it wasn't as massive a storm in southwestern Ontario, it was a storm of a different type, a hurricane type that caused mass problems in Ontario. So those are the types of things that you should look at when you are considering what types of storms that go on your maps and what you want to protect your community to. Next slide. So then you model the flood. So we picked what storm, we have the models to do it, we have the understanding for the community on how that water flows through the watershed. Then we used accepted software to do that. And the one we used was HEC-RAS, the Hydraulic Engineering Center of the U.S. Corps of Army Engineers river analysis system. So the nation can be comfortable that the model and the definition of the floodplain is done to a standard that should be expected. Next slide. When you choose a model, and these questions were asked at the session number 3, which is on hydraulics, a number of questions were asked about what model to choose, and really use the simplest model possible. Make sure that you understand from the community what concerns they have around the floodplain, and the model that you choose should answer the questions you're being asked. And the other thing is, make sure that you use a model that is commonly used in the area so that the professionals, experts that you ask to do the work, the science piece, understand that model and are capable and competent in its use. Next slide. So once you've got the model, what can you use to visualize on the ground what is happening? Air photos work really well, and this is an example of a 20 centimeter pixel air photo that was collected in 2020 by the province of Ontario. That is one tool for the community to understand where the different flood lines and where the different flows affect their community and what those risks are. Next slide. Don't ever underestimate what a good picture does, what a good photograph does. Make sure that you have the consultants or whoever's doing the work, or even the community, take pictures of the river, so that when the floodplains, when the inundation is put together, people can visualize what on the ground it actually means. So it's really important for people to understand what the impacts on the community are from the floodplain, and therefore respond in the way they feel is appropriate for the protection of their community. Next, please. Structures are a really important thing to talk about when you develop floodplain mapping, because structures are often where people say, well, it flooded up to this level. And there's lots of information, and the other thing is they don't move. So there's lots of information that when you talk to a community or a community member about structures, you can learn a lot to guide you in the development of floodplain mapping. So really important that structures be properly defined, but also used in a way that information on the final product, the floodplain, and the information the community wants can be visualized as you move forward. Next slide, please. So once it's all done, we use a hydraulic model, as I said before, and that produces the by using the flood of concern or floods of concern, it gives you flood elevations. And that is kind of the end result of the whole thing, but it may, from the flood mapping perspective, but much more can come from after that point. As I said, there are a number of ways this can be represented that makes sense to people that look at it, and it needs to be done in such a way that it is meaningful for the community. Next slide. So there are all kinds of different maps. So you can have thematic maps where you show the elevations, where you show the inundation areas that are just simply on a floodplain, on an air photo. Next. You can have line maps, and this is often what traditional floodplain mapping looks like, where it's put onto a line drawing, and the floodplain is shown as a line with lines across the floodplain perpendicular, showing where cross sections were defined in the model of the river. And at those cross sections, often you have the elevations of the flood or floods that the community wants to consider. Next slide. But there's lots of other things that can be put onto that map Many of the concerns that were expressed by the community weren't necessarily about what me as a floodplain mapper would have generally looked at. Many of the concerns were regarding the ecology, what was on the ground growing, what was on the ground living. And therefore, those types of themes can be put below the floodplain and the lines of the floodplain to speak to the concerns that the community has. So that's an important piece as well, to provide those products that are needed. Next, please. So the data can be used for many, many things. And it can be used, the elevation data that is brought up can be used for steepness of banks. One of the concerns the community brought forward was issues of erosion and banks stability. A lot of the information in the pictures, the mapping could be used for that. Air photos can be used for all kinds of stuff. As I talked before, the importance of the natural heritage to the community can be brought into the picture and understood, and its relation to flooding can be addressed as the community tries to understand what the floodplain means to them. Next slide. So what do we do with the maps? So it is really up to the community. In Ontario, we have policies that direct new development out of the flood-prone areas, but it's really what the First Nation wishes to do with them. And the map will be based on what the First Nation wishes to do. Risks, which we'll talk about in the final seminar, is an important piece of the discussion. And we'll talk about how those risks can be brought into discussion when using floodplain maps. So the First Nations really need to decide for themselves what to do with all this information and how it affects their decision-making around their community in the future. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark, for that overview of developing floodplain mappings for the communities. From here, we're going to switch gears and start to look at protocols and tools rather than process as we have been. So to start us off is Rochelle Smith from the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. So welcome, Rochelle.
Ani Boja, Rochelle Smith, Dashnakas, Dashkan Zibing, Donjapa, Meshakan Dorem, and Dajikan Stajge when I'm Edising. Sagoli, Rochelle Nyonguts, and the one you get the Lord, Dashkan Zibing Deneke. My name is Rochelle Smith. I come from Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, also known as Dashkan Zibing. My clan is Turtle, and I work for Chippewas of the Thames First Nation in the Treaties, Lands, and Environment Department as their Events and Promotions Coordinator. My primary work is in the Consultation Unit. Today, I'm going to briefly talk about the historic and modern protocols for the duty to consult, primarily COTTFN's protocol. Chippewa developed a consultation protocol known as the Windamagewin. This protocol is a living document that took a little over 2 years of community engagement to develop. Windamagewin is pronounced Windamagewin. Its meaning is he or she tells people, announces to people, informs people. The purpose of this protocol is to ensure that our relationships with other communities develop in future ways that are fully respectful of the breadth of Deshkan Zibing's responsibilities to these watersheds in ways that are protective of the full range of our rights. This protocol shall serve to guide governments and third parties interested in pursuing healthy and mutually beneficial relationships with Deshkan Zibing. Historically, our treaty partner Britain recognized these rights as seen within the joint context of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara in 1764. And within the subsequent treaties formed between 1790 and 1822, treaties are significant pacts and contracts. They are enduring relationship of mutual obligation that facilitated a peaceful coexistence between First Nations and non-First Nation people. Our protocol has many guiding principles. I'm going to share one of them, and that one is Matukwing. Its meaning is sharing. Our agreements with settler governments concern our sharing of the lands that the Creator has shared with us. We expect that governments interested in projects affecting our lands, waters, and well-being will demonstrate how the proposed project embodies the same spirit of sharing of what the Creator has provided, and also charge us with protecting. Next slide. Legislation, court cases, and policy changes have evolved the duty to consult into what it is today. In the Supreme Court case, Haida Nation versus BC's Ministry of Forests, the Crown has a duty to consult and, where appropriate, accommodate when the Crown contemplates conduct that might adversely impact potential or establish Aboriginal treaty rights. The Supreme Court of Canada recognized that the Crown has a duty to consult with Aboriginal peoples when it's engaged in matters that could adversely affect their rights or title to land, both of which are recognized by the Constitution. This duty is noted in the honor of the Crown. which is a constitutional standard imposed on the Crown to determine if it has acted properly when its servants engage affected peoples. Because of changes to legislation, court cases, and policies, First Nation communities have a stronger voice when it comes to impacts on their treaty and traditional lands. Although to some, this may seem a rather difficult undertaking, more so for First Nation communities. As stewards of the lands, the Creator has charged us with protecting the lands, waters, air, and well-being of all creation. When projects, policies, and proposals are reviewed, there's a consideration for impacts on our community members, our lands, our water, our animals, and on our treaty partners. Ultimately, we are all treaty people here. Through community engagement, we envision scenarios of two-eyed seeing, where both Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge may coincide with one another and provide a different outcome. Appropriate consultation between Deshkan-Zibing and federal, provincial, and municipal authorities serves several purposes. At its heart, appropriate consultation is a dialogue between communities, a mutual engagement, rather than a mere notification of an external party's intention. Our being fully informed about projects and decisions that may affect our nation protects our full range of rights and responsibilities as recognized within the traditional Anishinaabe law, in Canada's Constitution, and within the jurisprudence of Canada's courts and in customary international law. It burnishes the covenant chain by fostering a treaty relationship that should, but does not yet exist between our people and Canada. In addition to protecting our range of rights, appropriate accommodation also promotes and deepens the path of reconciliation that will ensure a healthier future for both settler and Anishinaabe communities. Appropriate consultation encourages the development of projects that are mutually beneficial to all parties, and it ensures that projects have wide legitimacy both within Deshkan-Zibing and also within the larger network of Anishinaabe nations at home and around the Great Lakes. Next slide. As mentioned earlier, we are all treaty people. Those treaties are significant pacts and contracts that share a mutual obligation. It's important to care for Mother Earth. She's the only one we have. As Anishinaabe, we understand that the Creator placed us within our world's web of spiritual and biophysical relationships in order for life to flourish. For all to enjoy the world, life flourishes when we base our relationships on the gifts of 7 grandfathers: wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. While attending classes at Algoma University for Alliance Management, we had the pleasure to speak with to listen to Joanne Robertson. Joanne played a key role in the Water Walker movement. She even wrote a children's book about Josephine Mandawan Ba called The Water Walker. I highly recommend reading this book if you haven't already, but Joanne said something to us that was all of life's water. All of life needs water to survive, but water doesn't need us. I have never thought of it this way before. I mean, I knew about it, but it never sunk in the way it did until Joanne had said it. Humans need water, plants need water, animals need water, but water has never needed humans, plants, or animals to survive. I want to close this with thanking every single one of you for taking the time to attend these webinars. It is truly important that we work together to care for Mother Earth like she has continued to care for us. Thank you.
It looks like we might be having some technical difficulties with the video. So I think just with the interest of time, we'll have people watch the video when we put out the link for this, but it is a community member from the Munsee Delaware Nation, just expressing her perspective to the water, which is very much similar to those that we have heard previously from the other community members that we've been privileged to be able to hear and work with. So if you just want to go to the next.
I got the sound working if you'd like to hear it.
Sure, let's give it a go. Yeah, it's not working. So
Sorry.
we'll just move on to the next presentation. That's fine. But get you miigwech, Rochelle. I think that everything that you have presented has been said in such a great way and really reflects the Indigenous ways of being. With that being said, to give another perspective on some of this important information in terms of protocols, I will now introduce Brennan. Over to you, Brennan.
Okay, miigwech, thank you, Carrie Ann and Rochelle and Mark and everyone on the call today. It's great to join you today from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chonatan Attawandaron peoples here in London, Ontario. I work with Chippewas of the Thames First Nation in Treaties, Lands, and Environment with Rochelle and our many of our other colleagues on lots of important issues and notably this great project bringing together local conservation authorities with First Nations to look at floodplain issues through two-eyed seeing approaches. And so I've been asked today to speak about protocols for on-the-ground activities and fieldwork, as this is certainly a pretty important part of our work. Next slide, please. So I thought I would begin by talking about the OCAP principles, which stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. And this comes to us from the First Nations Information Governance Group, who for, I think the last decade or two have been providing great resources and insights available at the URL on the slide below with respect to best practices for doing this work in Canada and Turtle Island at large. Could we advance the animation? So the first principle is ownership, which refers to the relationships that First Nations have with their cultural knowledge and the ownership of that knowledge, the data and the information that is collected through research practices. And so it's really incumbent to understand that information collection does remain within the ownership of the community or group, both individually and collectively, the same way that we as individuals in settler society have ownership and control over our own personal information. And this can extend to data ownership related to land, culture, and community information. Next, advance. The second principle is data control, which, as you can read, affirms that First Nations, communities, and representative bodies are within their rights to seek control over all aspects of a research project and the information management project processes that impact them through that project. It's recognized that control over research includes having opportunities to inform and engage on the staging of research from start to finish, and extends to controlling resources as well as reviewing processes, including the planning process, management of information, and so on. And Rochelle actively engages on behalf of Chippewa on this particular aspect through the Windham-Magay-Win. Access, as you can see, refers to information and data about the community remaining accessible to the community regardless of where it might be held. And this can be achieved through standardized, formalized protocols such as the Windham-Magay-Win and other examples. And the last is possession. And so data possession is a very critical part of research and ensures that First Nations themselves have the ownership and possession principle recognized through concrete control of data. And so we can also think about that this extends to the power for data that is in possession to be used for community purposes, including self-determination. Okay, next slide. I'm going to read now just an excerpt from another valuable resource for folks on the call who might be engaged in particular mapping work with First Nations. This comes to us from the volume Living Proof, the Essential Data Collection Guide for Indigenous Use and Land Use and Occupancy Map Surveys and Research Design. considerations for research purposes, produced by Terry Tobias in collaboration with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs some years ago now, back in 2009. But the preface to that book, I think, is sort of an interesting way of thinking about this important work of mapping collaboratively with Indigenous communities. And I'll also give a shout out to the Canadian Climate Atlas, who launched their Indigenous aspect of that atlas just this week. So you can check that out over at the Prairie Adaptation Collective. Thomas Berger, who was the forefather of environmental assessment in Canada through some of his work up on the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline back in the 1970s, wrote the foreword for this volume. And he says, a map as defined by cartographers is a representation of the surface of the earth or any part of it drawn on a flat surface and the positions of countries, kingdoms, states, mountains, and rivers. We use road maps to find our way about and atlases to locate faraway places. We read about them in the news. In short, they serve a rather limited and generally benign purpose of helping us orient ourselves geographically. Yet maps to Indigenous peoples around the world resonate with a dark ferocity and foreboding. For 5 centuries, maps were used to codify, to justify, and to sanctify an often bloody and always cruel colonization of the New World. Maps almost always were used as instruments of empire, human constructs imposed as a means of converting chunks of the Earth's surface into real estate to be bought and sold by non-Aboriginal people. Simply with a few simple pen strokes of a cartographer's stylus, the governments attempted to alienate Indigenous peoples from their territories. Government lawyers continue today, in fact, to exercise powers of maps to legitimatize claims over land and resources. Maps have also been enlisted by multinational corporations to gain concessions over commodities such as oil, mineral, and timber. Protected areas are likewise created by sketching lines on the map. Colonial maps, however, could not erase the knowledge of the land held by Indigenous peoples. If we look closer at the names of our mountains, rivers, and lakes, we will find Indigenous place names throughout these maps. During the last 30, 40 years in defense of Aboriginal title and rights, Indigenous peoples have used maps to convey their histories, express their knowledge of the land, which plays a critical and important role, not just as an expression of knowledge, but also as an important tool for effecting change in Canadian jurisprudence. And so I'll just dig in a little bit to Tobias and some of his guidance in a very quick way, but I would encourage you to check out the book if you're not familiar. So if we think about research as a framework process, we can see that there's critical questions that we need to answer when we structure our research process. Let's see the first one. So the first question is why? What is the primary objective of the research project? And we can think about that question, why, as being informed by that OCAP principles and developing sound practices that are respectful and reciprocal when designing research. And this is being actively practiced in this particular project through the collaboration with the First Nations and the conservation authorities and other stakeholder groups that are involved in the project by setting out in a good way at the inception of the project to make clear the why of the project. Next. Our second question relates to who, and who is generally can be thought about in terms of who are we interested in sampling and selecting in a research project. And when we're doing this in collaboration with First Nations communities, as we have in this particular project, it is very much based in a geographic sense around the First Nations communities in the Deshkan-Zibi watershed area, the Thames River watershed area, and that includes Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Munsee, Delaware, Oneida, and Moravian Town. So these are the four communities who have been actively involved in every step of the research. Next. Where, as I say, is similar in the regard of delineating a particular geographic study area. We've taken a regional approach in this project through floodplain management and asking questions related to water for the Deshkan-Zibi, which extends from the headwaters up near Stratford, Ingersoll, Tavistock area, right down to the lower reaches of the St. Clair River of this second largest watershed here in southwestern Ontario. Next. When is a very interesting question, particularly when we think about climate change and as we've been hearing about all the good work informed by the conservation authorities, we can look at flood return periods in a historic context. We can also think about future predictions associated with regional climate scenario projections based on representative concentration pathways of greenhouse gases as we boldly move into a new future where it is predicted the Earth will be warming in excess of 1.5 to 2 degrees, conservatively speaking, underscoring the urgency for action on climate change, not just to prepare for the impacts and adaptation, but also to do our best to mitigate the greenhouse gases causing the problem in the first place. Next. And lastly, Tobias encourages us to ask the question, what? And we do this through open-ended questions developed in collaboration with First Nations around what matters in terms of categorical information and which questions are most important. And we've really focused in large part on two-eyed seeing approaches, looking at the science of watershed management, but also the Indigenous cultural contributions of social, ecological, and cultural knowledge associated with the river that many of these communities have called home for millennia. Okay, we'll advance now. Certainly not to be overlooked, as underscored in the OCAP principles, is the need for achieving confidentiality and accountability in data collection processes. And I think this is my last point on this slide. Consent and participation goes right along with this. Okay. Honorariums, remuneration, very important part, which we have practiced throughout this process as well, as we have contributions of community members. And making recordings, transcriptions, and translations widely available to the community, as well as participating partners. And I think we've covered this. So through sound data management and analysis and planning, this has been certainly the idea of a co-led approach to research. Okay, it's a little different when you're not clicking the mouse button to advance your own slides, but thanks for your patience with all of that. Community respect and protection are certainly important parts of this process as well, and the First Nations Information Governance Group does encourage us to keep this in mind, that culture, identity, tradition, and self-determination, these are values that we should be seeking to uphold in our land use planning and in our community planning. And as we look at from the 10,000-foot view here of the CMO communities in southwestern Ontario, this is certainly very important historically with respect to this traditional territory of three distinct cultural groups, but also in the idea of the ecological value of this land. This is the second largest intact Carolinian zone with many species at risk in southwestern Ontario. Next slide. So into the nuts and bolts here, we use a tool, Rochelle, myself and others at Treaties, Lands and Environment called the Community Knowledge Keeper. It is a great product out there from CUSIN, a consultancy based out of British Columbia that specializes in traditional land use and occupancy mapping and has a great architecture in place for data management. So we have been documenting this project, as you can see in the screenshot, but much of the work that we do on environmental land use planning and management and consultation work is archived using this database approach at Chippewa. Okay, thanks very much. Happy to answer any questions that you might have or keep in touch. Here's my information, and over to you, Carrie.
Thanks, Brennan. The information you shared complements nicely the information that Rochelle shared with us and is important information for everyone who is embarking on this important work to know and understand. Next, we have Brandon Dockstader from Oneida Nation of the Thames and Carrie Blasey from the Canadian Environmental Law Association to speak on tools that can be accessed to complement and assist in undertaking this kind of work. So we'll turn it over to you, Brandon.
Great, thank you, Carrie-Ann. I appreciate it. Sagali swagweg, Brandon Dockstader, Nyangits, Ogwali ni wagi delod, Onyataag ngwehuene, Wagasanunit. So I just said hello. My name is Brandon Dockstader. I'm Bear Clan from the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and thank you for welcoming me to this virtual space today. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm here to talk about the source water protection toolkit in Indigenous communities. And I work for my nation as the environment and consultation coordinator. Next slide. Okay, so an overview of the source water protection toolkit. So in 2017, we initiated this work, the CMO communities of Chippewa, the Thames, Oneida Nation, and Munsee Delaware Nation, as well as in partnership with the Canadian Environmental Law Association, CELA. So this was a collaborative community-based project to identify threats to our source water in our communities along the Thames River, and to develop legal tools and policies aimed at that protection. And so with funding from the Law Foundation of Ontario, our communities and CELA devised legal policy tools to address these concerns. A lot of them were historical concerns. Some of them a lot newer as well. But yeah, these threats include things from industrial discharges, spills, sewage overflows, the impact of phosphorus, loading, and pesticide use. So in response to what was identified and prioritized by the CMO communities, an Indigenous source water protection toolkit was created. And this toolkit provides a range of legal tools which can be used in Indigenous communities to protect source water and mitigate threats. Next slide. So some questions as I was thinking about this is like, why is this work important to you? What are the threats to the river, and how is this related to floodplain mapping? So this work is really important for the nation, for myself, and for our communities as a whole. It's nation building, capacity building. It allows us to build partnerships. As I mentioned, this was in 2017, so 5 years ago now, and we're still looking at this work and the relationships that were initiated from this partnership still continue to this day. It also created that framework or that toolkit that allowed us to tackle these issues, and creating policies like wetland bylaws, nutrient bylaws. And so this is a complex issue in our communities, and in Oneida in particular, we do a lot of, we're unique in that that we're not technically a reserve. And so we do land management activities on our own without the discretion of Indigenous Service Canada, without the government. And so creating a BCR or a land management code, there are certain intricate ways that needs to be done in different communities. And this allows us to look at all those options and move that forward. Next slide. So the source water protection project profile. So this was creating source water protection project, defining First Nations jurisdiction for reserve lands and resources, our communities to identify, assess, mitigate actual potential threats to the sources of drinking water, and as I mentioned, to develop that legal and policy tool to protect and improve our source water. There's a link that will be put in the chat here for this YouTube video. It's about 13, 15 minutes long. It really goes into depth about that community perspective, talking about the memories of the river and about the threats to the river. So if you're really interested in getting that wider perspective from youth, from elders, and community members from our 3 communities, I'd really recommend you check that video out. And just so like to identify some of the threats in Oneida, we held a survey in the nation to talk about some of these threats, and it wasn't it was more broader, and it wasn't looking just at the river. And so we were talking, so the number 1 identified threat in Oneida in terms of environment was the Green Lane landfill and contamination. The second threat was water issues, specifically related to water. So this goes right back to that source water protection. It's on the minds of communities. Number 3 was climate change. Number 4 was farming pesticides and phosphorus offloads. 5th was biodiversity loss, just for that list. But so you can tell community is concerned. They want to know that these issues are being addressed. And so that's how this project relates to this, because it allows us to say, okay, we've already kind of created this framework for doing this legal policy engagement. But now when we take that context into floodplain mapping, you know, a community has said this is an issue we want identified, and this comes from that work as well. Next slide. Oh, there's that picture there. So it's a 5-phased approach. We can just go to the next slide for sake of time. And basically what we did is we held, as after having discussions with our steering committee, with chiefs and councils, and forming that committee, we met with community members to have this discussion around what the threats were. We held 6 workshops in the communities, and after that, CELA drafted legal instruments to respond to those threats that were identified. And then the youth ambassadors went out and brought that report to community members, talked about it, and the communities took it from there to either adopt those policies or do what they wanted to. And then in our context, we felt like after the report was finished, there was a little bit more Oneida-izing, is what I called it, that we needed to do. So we kind of went through those documents, through those policies, and changed things up and added some wording and stuff to put them through a draft legislation. Next slide. Yeah, and as I mentioned here, we gathered a lot of traditional knowledge, any changes in the quality of the water and health, and in the watershed. So it was a really good project to really hear those stories from community members. Next slide. And as I mentioned, it was a community-based decision. So this was in discussion with community members and with chief and council, and identifying also and acknowledging like the various government arms within the community, including our Haudenosaunee Traditional Chiefs Council, our clan families, and the elected body. So yeah, next slide. And then we just want to honor and pay tribute to the late George Henry, who was a former counselor and elder in the Chippewa Thames First Nation, who was a mentor and leader for his community, who passed away after this project had been completed. So just wanted to honor George. He was a great, awesome dude. So yeah, we'll go for his work. And next slide. And that's everything. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to Carrie for the rest of the presentation.
Thanks so much, Brandon. That was a wonderful introduction to the background and how we got to the stage of having these 5 very specific legal tools. And so I'm going to turn to them all very briefly. Next slide. Great. So we were looking to address sources of contamination within the watershed. And so when you take a source water protection approach, it means you're looking at both groundwater and surface waters. What are those contaminants? And Brandon noted a number of the priorities that the community raised. And also, how do those contaminants move? So what are the pathways within the watershed? In the event of extreme rainfall events or flooding, how do those pollutants get transferred along and throughout the watershed? So one of the ways we came up with trying to understand the pollutants, what they were, how to control them, how to mitigate them so they weren't becoming threats to source water, was through the use of bylaws. And so at the federal level, there is a dearth of legal instruments regarding source water protection in First Nation communities. And so we actually drafted 10, I'll say template bylaws, 10 template bylaws that actually look at issues like septic and nutrient loading and agricultural lands and waste management and wetlands, so that the communities we were working with had some legal tools with prohibitions and penalties written in that could then be adapted for community use. And so the wetland one particular might be of most interest, because as we know, wetlands are nature's natural flood control systems, and they're also invaluable to filtering pollutants. And so within the wetland bylaw we drafted, it includes things like, you cannot dispose of waste within the wetland zone, and it's up to a community to determine what that wetland zone is. Also no person shall use the wetland zone for the storage or the disposal or the treatment of landfill or contaminants or hazardous substances. So again, this was just one way to try and get at what are the contaminants, what are the sources that could pollute a source water system, and what is one legal means to actually try to prevent that before that contamination happens. Next slide. Thanks. The second tool we looked at, and this came out of all of the discussions that we had held, was the need to actually develop a consultation and accommodation protocol, essentially, that had as a priority source water protection. And so what we heard from communities was that there was need, whether having discussions with government or private entities, there was a need to be able to assert water rights and ensure that a source water approach was being taken when conversations about development projects or landfills or any decision essentially that could significantly impact the watershed were occurring. And so you can find it online. I think the link is in the chat box, and you can find kind of a draft consultation and accommodation protocol that I would say has a water first approach. And this template was based on many other examples from other First Nation communities across Ontario and Canada. And so it very much is, I'll say, like a mashup. And you can kind of move the provisions around and tailor it, like Brandon mentioned, Oneida Nation had done, to make it more suitable for each community. Next slide. The third tool we looked at was ensuring that community members knew their voice could be heard through Ontario's Environmental Bill of Rights. So this is a law that dates back to 1994. And as part of this law, there is the Environmental Registry of Ontario. And that registry is where postings are made for permits and licenses and new laws and approvals, anything that could affect human health and the environment. So we did put this in as a tool within the toolkit to flag that there are rights to participation, there are rights to know that are available by virtue of the Environmental Bill of Rights. Next slide. Another issue that arose based on community conversations was the need to have, again, source water protection provisions within agricultural lease agreements. And so what we actually did was, this might seem a bit technical, but we took the template lease agreement that's available under the Indian Act system, and we added provisions that actually establish rights and obligations of the landlord and tenant with how the land can be used, specifically around fertilizer application, again, thinking about setbacks, thinking about nutrient loading on the watershed. Next slide. And the final tool I'll highlight, and I know this was very quick to go through all 5 of them, but the links are posted and you're welcome to read up on them more. The final tool we looked at was just providing background information on the Provincial Clean Water Act. And under the Clean Water Act, which came out following the E. coli outbreak in Walkerton in 2000, this act was developed with source water protection as its priority at its core. And so this act mandates that source water protection committees be established. And it also states that these source water protection committees must consult with neighboring First Nation communities in defining their source water protection area, understanding threats, and understanding the land use within that source water protection zone. And so there is an opt-in mechanism that goes beyond just the duty to consult. So within the Clean Water Act itself, there is an opt-in. So if a First Nation community wants to have a more active role in actually setting the contaminants or the issues that are of priority in that region, there is an opt-in mechanism under this Provincial Act. And with that, that concludes my part of the presentation. And great, there's my contact details. You're always welcome to reach out, and I can be reached at the email address on that slide. Thanks so much, Carrie-Anne and Brendan.
Thank you, Carrie and Brandon, for that great presentation. Lots of good tools there for our community members to be able to look into. With that, I know we're running over a little bit of overtime. We do have one more presentation. And so with that, I'm going to turn it right over to Mark.
Thank you, Carrie-Anne. My last presentation is about how does a First Nation know that the science that's being done is being done well. And so the challenge is that the work that we're doing as engineers and as scientists defining floodplains is really important for our community and will significantly affect, potentially significant affect large numbers of people in those communities. Next slide. The way you address that is you have peer review. And it's ensured that there is a review of everything that's done, and you get experts from out of the community, outside of the technical team that's doing the work to review its results. And in this case, a number of engineers and scientists from neighboring conservation authorities, municipalities, and First Nations people sat on a peer review committee, as well as a hired peer reviewer to review some of the details of the results, so that there was a broad community and expert understanding and acceptance of the work that was being done. Next. So it's not a static process. It should continue throughout the process, and I'll explain that as we go along. But it's not just a one-time look at the results. Next slide. So what peer review looks at everything, and right from before you start, which is the assumptions, then the methodology, all the way down the conclusions. So the peer review is not just looking at what you come up with. It's also looking at how you came up with it and whether that process you followed is a proper and defendable process. Next slide. So what do you want in a peer reviewer? You want somebody that is an expert in what you're doing, somebody that knows the river, somebody that understands the hydrology and hydraulics and all those types of stuff, and the models. They need to be objective, and they need to be able to spend the time you need to properly review your project. Next slide. So the goals of the peer review are three, and I'll show you how they can be really broken up. The first two, A and B, make sure that the standards and the approaches are right, and make sure the plan that you're taking and the process you're taking get you to the end that you're saying you will get to. That's A and B. And then C is to make sure what you came up with is the best it can be. Next slide. So we break that up. Those first two we call quality assurance or project design. We make sure that the design of the project is defendable and it gets us to the result you need to be. There needs to be peer review in the quality assurance. So that whole piece, nothing to do with whatever you come up with. It all is about how you do it, has to be peer reviewed. And finally, what you come up with needs to be checked. It has to be a defendable final product. Next slide. And how do you do that? You look at preparing an element, how you're going to do it. It's looked at. The peer reviewer provides feedback. You revise that until you get something that is acceptable. And then you continue round and round as you develop more pieces of the project and develop more results from the project. Next slide. The main things that you're looking at is the base mapping and all the data that you're bringing into the project. The hydrology, which is calculating how much flow is going to go down through the system, and the hydraulics, which looks to how much of the land is inundated by that flow. Next slide. To complete the peer review, you need to take what the peer review says, and you need to utilize those in getting the best product. And then you make a record of what that peer review said, so you can show whoever's reviewing the project how you came to the final process and to the final results, and that they were reasonable, and that you had looked at what people said, and that you had either revised or defended what you were doing as you went through the project. Next slide. Thank you. If anybody is developing a project and would like to see the terms of reference for both the peer review committee and the third-party consulting peer review that we developed, that's available, and we can provide that as well. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark, for that overview. Once again, we've reached our time and any unanswered questions from today's webinar will be answered at next week's webinar. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to take questions. So these sessions are being recorded, although, and will be posted on the Green Communities YouTube page at the following link, and that'll be posted in the chat, as well as on the SIPS webpage with the link being posted in the chat as well. For those who missed the previous webinars, they are now posted. Please give us a few days to get this webinar posted, and note that we will also distribute via email to registrants upon the completion of the series. With that, I would like to say Gitchi Miigwech, a big thank you for attending today's webinar. We would really appreciate if you took a moment to fill in the quick online survey. A link is provided in the chat box, and any feedback that you share will definitely be appreciated. So that link will be there. Our next session is next Wednesday, March 23rd at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time, using the same Zoom info you accessed today. This will be the final webinar of this series, and we will discuss risk assessments as well as tools that can assist in managing risk. If you haven't yet registered, please consider registering online via the event registration. And with that, I say Gitchi Miigwech again to all that attended and presented today, and we hope to see you next week. Bamapi.